Chapter 8, Back on the Farm, Part 2, Saturday, October 2nd, 1880. Wake up, Will. We have to finish building our corn crib this weekend. On Monday, I want us to begin harvesting the corn and we have to store it, his father said. Will slowly climbed out of bed. He was tired, but he knew the work had to be done. It was important to allow ears of corn to dry on their stalks in the field for as long as possible. They should be taken off before wind, rain, or snow blow down the mature plants, which would make it more difficult to harvest. After breakfast, Will and his father headed out next to their barn to continue construction of the corn crib. Their corn crib was built with boards nailed to a frame of heavy lumber. The boards had narrow gaps between them to allow the air to circulate and dry the corn. The two men braced the interior to make the building more stable and help support the weight of the harvest. They would store the corn still on the cob to keep the kernels from retaining moisture and spoiling. Corn will rot or mold if it becomes damp, which will make it unfit to sell or use as livestock feed. I never really thanked you, son, for coming back home to help on the farm after your Uncle Jim died, Will's father said. I know you were enjoying your career as a railroad man. I've enjoyed my time back on the farm, Dad, and I can't believe how much I'm learning about farming. Working with you, young Jim, Edudu, White Cloud, and Aunt Lynetta has also been a lot of fun, Will assured his father. Besides, I was ready to move on from working on the railroad anyway. His father nodded as the two continued building their corn crib. Early that afternoon, Aunt Lynetta and White Cloud came over to help them put on the roof. Good afternoon, Aunt Lynetta and Edudu, Will said. Good afternoon, the two replied. Will's Edudu White Cloud had gone to live with his daughter shortly after her husband, Uncle Jim, had died. He has been a lot of help for Aunt Lynetta, and she said he was good company. Your corn crib really is starting to look good, White Cloud said. We should be able to finish this building today. White Cloud was right, and by the end of the day, the corn crib was completed. The four of them stood back proudly and looked at their handiwork. I would have to say this is one of the finest corn cribs I've ever seen, Aunt Lynetta said. We now have a great place to store our corn, Henry. Sure do, Lynetta. I can relax now knowing that when we harvest the corn in about another month, we won't have to worry about losing any because of rotting, Henry said. You remember the last time we planted corn about 4 years ago, we lost a lot of the crop. Aunt Lynetta and White Cloud nodded in agreement. Will's younger sisters, Parthena and Sarah, ran up just then. Hey, Daddy, Mama said to come to the house because supper is ready. They all gathered up their tools and headed for the Perry log cabin. Kazar had a long table of food that she had set up outside for the workers. This is like a picnic, Mama, Parthena said, smiling. After washing up, everyone pulled up a chair to the table. Kazar had cooked collard greens, black-eyed peas, cornbread with lots of freshly churned butter, and carrots and peas mixed together. She had prepared different meat dishes, rabbit, quail, chicken, venison, and for dessert she had hot apple pie. They bowed their heads as Henry blessed the food. After the prayer, Henry exclaimed, My, Kazar, this is more than a picnic. It's like having Christmas dinner in the summer. Everyone cheered. That's right, they all said as they began filling up their plates with the delicious-looking food. Young Jim, Annie Sue, and their family pulled up in their wagon in time to join the others for supper. I'm sorry I didn't get here earlier to help with the corn crib, Dad, but Annie Sue and I were repairing the fences in the north pasture over near the train tracks, and it took longer than we thought, young Jim said. That's okay, son, Henry answered. We had plenty of help. I'm glad you fixed that fence. I know the neighbors will be happy our cows won't be getting in their fields anymore. White Cloud turned to Will and said, A bunch of us are going for our annual hunting trip up north. Do you want to go with us this time, Will? Every year, most of the men in the Elmstead Pew settlement go north to hunt deer and other wild game to provide their families with additional food for the winter. Sometimes there could be as many as 20 of them, but they would only hunt enough for what the group would need to feed their families, and at the end of the hunt, the meat would be shared equally. White Cloud was very happy with this arrangement, because the Indian way is to respect nature's creatures and only fulfill your needs. I think I will go with you this year, Edudu. Ever since I was young, I wanted to go, Will answered. When are we leaving? In November, when all the harvesting is done and the winter wheat has been planted, White Cloud answered. Also, around the middle of November is when the full-blown rut begins. The rut is the breeding season for the deer, and that's when the male deer, known as bucks, come out of their hiding places and become more visible. "I can't wait," said Will as they continued their dinner. When November arrived, a caravan of several wagons full of happy men could be seen leaving the Elmstead Pugh settlement. Wilfred Scott owned a big cabin on a lake in northern Ontario where they would stay during their hunting trips. Everyone called Wilfred Uncle Wolf because on one of these hunting trips a rabid wolf attacked him and he had to kill the crazy animal with his bare hands before he had a chance to bite him. He was too old to hunt now, but he and his brother-in-law Zip Johnson did the cooking for the men during the week. Will never did know Mr. Johnson's first name. He was always just known to him as Zipper. So Uncle Wolf and Uncle Zip were the cooks, and you learned to be really nice to them if you wanted to eat well. The journey to the camp was long, but the camaraderie among the men made the time fly by. Will drove a wagon with his father, a Dudu, brother, little Carl, and their good friends John Freeman Walls with his sons Henry, Matthew, and David. Big Carl Baker was driving another wagon with Dr. Clare, Walter Scott, Uncle Samuel Bass, Elmer Scott, the Anderson brothers, and George Kerr, owner of Kerr's General Store. Several more wagons carried supplies and the remainder of the hunters, including Mr. Elliott, Malcolm McKay, Ed Stowe, Eric Martindale, and Terry Tyler. There were many other local families, including the Willises, Phillips, Olettes, Baines, McMurns, Chauvins, Quinlans, Sigans, Reynolds, Chapmans, St. Pierres, McDermotts, Sylvesters, Hayes, Trepaniers, Cross, Emerys, Baychards, Kennedys, Maters, Dupies, Chittles, Lachances, Bernies, Trombleys, Mullins, Lawheads, Lesprance, McGuires, and Angers. White Cloud sat in the seat next to Will as he drove the wagon. "Since this is your first hunting trip with us, I think I should share with you some deer hunting techniques you should know," White Cloud said. "There are many different ways to hunt white-tailed deer. For example, there's tree stand hunting, still hunting, ground blind hunting, and group or drive hunting. Most of the hunters with us will use the group or drive method. That's when some of the men will stay at one spot while the others will try and force the deer in their direction. When I hunt alone, since I use my bow and arrow, still hunting is the best because of the challenge of going one-on-one with the buck. You must move silently in the woods, remaining concealed while you track the deer." "That must require a lot of patience, Dudu," Will said. "Yes, it does," White Cloud answered, "but there are signs that deer leave which can make the hunt easier. There are rubs, which are marks on the trunks and low branches of trees where a buck has rubbed the velvet off their antlers. This will leave a mark because it takes the bark off the tree. Scrapes are places where the bucks scratch the ground and urinate. Finally, their tracks will tell you the size, species, and age of a deer." Will listened intently as his Dudu continued. "For example, a 3-inch to 3.5-inch track is a baby deer or fawn. 4 inches a yearling doe or female deer. A 4.5-inch track can be an adult doe or yearling buck or male deer, and 6-inch tracks and larger are adult bucks. Tracks are probably the most overlooked of all deer signs, but they carry lots of valuable information. They can tell you which way the deer was traveling and even the approximate time of day." "How can a deer track tell you the time of day a deer has passed through?" asked little Carl, who was also listening to the conversation. "If the tracks point toward their bedding areas, they were likely made in the morning, while tracks pointing toward feeding areas are usually made in the afternoon," White Cloud answered. He shared more hunting secrets with the two young men while they continued to Uncle Wolf's cabin. On the second day, the group finally arrived. Even though many of the men had been there before, they were still impressed by the beauty of the area. The cabin was in a clearing on a small hill about 30 yards from the shores of the lake. They were surrounded by trees as far as you could see on all sides. Will stood on the hill beside the cabin admiring the breathtaking view. "Come on, men," Uncle Wolf said. "Let's unload the wagon so I can start preparing supper. The hunt starts tomorrow, and once we eat, I'm going to get out the cards, because Zip and I want to defend our whist card game championship." Everyone laughed. They knew that those two would end up winning the championship again, because they all wanted to eat good for the week. Next morning, the men divided into groups of 4. Each group was assigned an area of the forest to hunt in that day. White Cloud, Will, Little Carl, and Henry Walls were one group because all 4 of them were hunting with bow and arrow. They were assigned the South Ridge, which Uncle Zip described as an ideal location for bow hunting. The thick underbrush would allow them to be concealed as they stalked their prey. When they had climbed to the top of the ridge, White Cloud surveyed the area. "Since there are 4 of us, we will split up and go in different directions, then slowly work back towards Little Carl, who will climb into this tree and watch for the deer to approach." After Henry, Will, and White Cloud went into the woods, Little Carl stood looking up into the branches of the tall tree. He had failed to tell White Cloud he was afraid of heights, so now he had a decision to make. Since stand hunting could be done in the trees or on the ground, he decided to build a ground blind out of branches and leaves to hide from any approaching deer. He lay in his blind for about a half an hour when he heard a rustling in the brush 20 feet to his right. Reaching behind his back, he quietly pulled an arrow out of his quiver, just as a large male buck raised his head above the bushes. The deer tentatively sniffed the air as he moved in the direction Little Carl was hiding. With each step the deer took, Little Carl pulled further back on his bowstring and slowly began standing behind his blind so he would have a clear shot. Suddenly, the big buck stopped, and even though he couldn't yet see Little Carl, he glared in his direction and then ran back into the thick brush. Confused at what startled the deer, Little Carl stood completely up. Just then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a huge paw coming towards the side of his head, but it was too late. The big bear knocked Little Carl over the branches and leaves that he had piled up to make his hiding place. The bear was immediately on top of his helpless victim, gnashing and slashing at him with his teeth and paws and ripping the quiver of arrows off his back. Little Carl kicked wildly at the attacking bear with his feet, finally connecting with the bear's nose. The wild animal backed up, swinging his huge head from side to side. His ears went back and he began making a popping sound with his jaws, indicating he was preparing for another charge. He came at the prone figure on the ground, but the big bear stopped just short of the injured man. 2 more bluff charges, then the bear began barking and making moaning sounds. Little Carl knew that the next charge would be his last. Beside him lay his quiver of arrows, so he slowly pulled one out as his only potential weapon. The bear and Little Carl's eyes locked with each other in preparation of the inevitable attack. Raising himself on his elbows, Little Carl held his arrow in the direction of his adversary. The bear charged, coming towards Little Carl at full speed, when all of a sudden a blood-curdling yell reverberated throughout the forest. The bear stopped instantly in his tracks and turned just in time to see White Cloud flying through the air at him with his knife clenched tightly between his teeth. The Indian landed on the big bear's back and immediately wrapped his arms around the animal's neck. The bear began shaking from side to side, trying to throw the intruder off. He began to stand erect, and as he did, White Cloud released his right hand from around the bear's neck. He then grabbed his knife from his mouth and began hitting the bear in the nose with the butt of the handle. The bear let out a howl, flung White Cloud off of him, and bounded into the woods. Henry and Will ran up just as the bear disappeared into the brush. Will rushed to the side of his friend Little Carl, while Henry assisted White Cloud to his feet. "Are you okay, Little Carl?" "Yes, I'm okay, but I think my ankle was broken when the bear first attacked," Little Carl said. White Cloud and Henry came over to the other two. "How did the bear get you down out of the tree?" White Cloud asked. "Actually, I made a ground blind and waited for the deer," Little Carl sheepishly replied. He didn't want to reveal to his 3 friends that the reason he stayed on the ground was because of his fear of heights. "If I knew you were going to stay on the ground, I would have given you some tips to remember in order to prevent a bear attack," White Cloud said. "First of all, you have to be alert at all times. Bears usually attack if their cubs are near, if a human is too close to their food supply, or they are surprised and startled." "Well, I don't know the reason this bear attacked me," Little Carl said, "but thank you for saving my life." Will and Henry made a litter or stretcher to carry Little Carl back to the camp. When they arrived, Uncle Wolf and Uncle Zip took over, cleaning off the blood and treating Little Carl's wounds. At the end of the day, when all of the hunters had returned, little Carl became the center of attention while he told everyone about his encounter with the bear. They all congratulated White Cloud on his bravery in helping to save little Carl's life. "How come you never killed the bear, Mr. White Cloud?" Eric Martindale asked. "I knew she was not a predatory bear and she probably had her cubs nearby, so I didn't want them to lose their mother because without her they wouldn't be able to survive in the wild alone," White Cloud replied. Fortunately, other than the broken ankle, little Carl had no serious injuries, so was able to stay until the end of the hunt. He was confined to the camp, but he didn't mind because he enjoyed the company of Uncle Wolf and Uncle Zip, and he loved the old-time stories they had to tell. By Friday, the group had enough deer to feed their families, so they packed up for their journey home. On the ride back, little Carl was able to sit up, so he rode beside Will while he drove the wagon. "You had an exciting experience, didn't you?" Will said. "Sure did. Lynn will be surprised when she sees me hobbling up to the house," Carl answered. "Looks like somebody will be spoiled by their wife when they get back," Will said, laughing, as the wagons carrying the men from the Elmstead-Pugh settlement continued down the winding road home. Winter was finally here, and it was the time of year when the Perry and Walls families would go ice harvesting together. This was a week-long, very labor-intensive process that required as much help as possible. Henry Perry had to insist Aunt Lynetta stay home, and she only agreed when he asked her to make some of her delicious sugar cookies and hot cocoa for them when they returned. The Perrys met the Walls men on the shores of Lake St. Clair early that morning. "Good morning, John Freeman." "Morning, boys," Henry Perry said. "Good morning," John Freeman and his three sons, Henry, Matthew, and David, replied. "Looks like the ice will be perfect for our harvest," John Freeman said. "Yes," Henry Perry said, "it's probably as much as 30 inches thick in some places. So young Jim and Will, you only need to go out about 100 yards offshore with the horses and the stone boats full of ice harvesting tools. A doo-doo will show you the best spot for us to start scraping the snow off the ice. Once this is done, you will cut a hole to find out exactly how thick the ice is." John Freeman had made some ice scraping tools that were perfect for this job. The tool was a long, flat metal blade with a handle on each end. There were enough for all of them to pare off and clean a wide area of snow from the ice. Once this was completed, the men measured grids on the ice, which are lines crossing parallel with each other. An ice plow was then pulled by the horses to cut grooves on the grid, usually no bigger than 14 or 16-inch squares, because you had to be able to pull the ice blocks out of the water. Finally, it was time to break for lunch, so the two families brought out their respective baskets of food and set it up buffet style. Matthew and David built a fire to heat up the coffee and to give the work crew some relief from the cold. Will and Henry Walls erected a portable lean-to which helped block the wind blowing across the open lake. When completed, all the men settled back to enjoy their coffee and sandwiches. "Mr. Perry, I would like to ask you something," Henry Walls began as the others turned in his direction. "As you know, I have been courting your daughter Parthena for the last 4 years. My father has given me and my brothers some land, and I can afford to support a family now. So may I have your daughter's hand in marriage?" Henry Perry knew Henry Walls and the rest of the Walls boys since they were born. He knew they were good men, and he respected the whole family. Matthew Walls had even saved young Jim and Will's life when he pulled them out of the Puce River with a tree branch on Will's first day of school. Their mother, Jane King, had raised them well, and Henry would be good to his daughter. Besides, he smiled, with the same first name as him, he had to be okay. "I was wondering when you two were going to finally get married. Kazar has been asking Parthena every day. Of course, you may marry my daughter. When is the big day?" "We want to get married in the spring. Parthena said she would like to have the wedding in May when all the flowers will be in bloom. We will exchange our vows at the First Baptist Church of Puce, and then we could have the reception down by the Puce River on my parents' property, which is only a mile down the road," Henry Walls answered. "Kazar, Jane King, and Aunt Lynetta are sure going to be happy with this good news, and they are going to have fun planning this wedding," John Freeman said. Everyone congratulated Henry and talked about how the Walls and Perrys were now more than friends. They were family. "You know, Henry, since you will be in our family and we have the same first name, from now on we're going to have to be known as Henry W. and Henry P., Henry Perry said, smiling broadly at his future son-in-law. After finishing what turned out to be a very interesting lunch break, the men returned to their work. The next part of the ice harvesting was the hardest of all. They had to use the ice saw, which was similar to a crosscut saw used in lumbering. They cut along the grid lines, then with breaking bars, which were used like crowbars, they detached these blocks from the field of ice. A wooden chute which John Freeman had made last year was put partly in the water, and with their ice tongs they hauled the blocks of ice out of the water, up the chute, and directly into the stone boats. When the stone boats had been loaded, they roped off the open hole until the next morning. For safety reasons, it had to be roped off because of people coming onto the ice to skate or have races with their horses and sleighs. The ice harvesting equipment was put on the sleds, and they headed home to put the ice in the ice houses. The Walls men took one wagon load of ice, and the Perrys took the other. When the Perrys arrived home, they immediately began unloading the ice blocks. Before putting them in the ice house, they packed sawdust around each block for insulation to prevent them from melting. It's important we separate the ice blocks before supper, otherwise they will freeze together and will be hard to break apart later, Henry P. told young Jim and Will. He then turned to White Cloud. You go on home, Doo-Doo. The boys and I can unload. Tell Aunt Lynetta we're sorry we couldn't make it over for sugar cookies and cocoa, but we were out on the lake longer than we thought because Henry W. requested Parthena's hand in marriage. White Cloud smiled and turned to leave. He knew Henry P. was a proud, soon-to-be father-in-law again. After the rest of the ice had been unloaded, the men headed into the house for a nice hot supper prepared by Khazar. They looked forward to this because when they took off their overalls, they were so frozen they would stand up on their own. Next morning, bright and early, the Perrys met the Wallses on Lake St. Clair at the roped-off hole they had left in the ice after the harvest the previous day. Good morning, John Freeman, Henry P. said. Khazar was excited about the good news, and Parthena was so happy that I had given my blessings of the marriage she couldn't stop smiling and talking all night. Same thing at our home, John Freeman replied. Jane was running around all evening planning the reception at our place. I'm sure she will be contacting Khazar soon so they can start making the guest list and other arrangements. Yes, Khazar has already said they must get together. Her and Parthena started working on wedding dress patterns last night, Henry P. said. I must warn you, Henry W., that you better get out of the way of the women planning a wedding. All you have to do is agree to all their suggestions. They all began laughing, including Henry W., because they knew what Henry P. said was true. The men started unloading their equipment to begin another hard day of ice harvesting. It was early yet, and you couldn't see more than 40 yards in either direction because of an early morning mist that had settled over the frozen lake. Matthew, David, and young Jim removed the ropes and stakes from around the opening. The overnight cold temperatures had hardened a thin layer of ice over the open hole. They turned to retrieve their ice-cutting instruments when everyone heard the rumbling of horses' hooves galloping over the ice. All of the men looked in the direction of the oncoming sound just as Malcolm McKay and Mr. Elliott came charging out of the mist. They were whooping and hollering as they raced each other with their horse and sleigh. It was obvious if they didn't stop, they would go right over the open hole in the ice where Matthew, David, and young Jim had just removed the ropes. The Perry and Walls men began jumping up and down, shouting and waving their arms wildly to direct the racers away from the hole. At first, both racers thought the shouting and waving men were encouraging them on. However, Mr. Elliott sensed urgency in their actions. He began pulling back on his horse, trying to bring him to a stop. Malcolm, thinking this was an act of surrender, continued racing onward. Just as he went past the Perrys and Wallses, he saw the hole, but only in time for him to jump off the sleigh to safety. Unfortunately, it was too late for his horse, which plunged through the thin layer of ice with the sleigh still attached. All the men rushed to the edge of the hole where the horse was splashing in terror. White Cloud grabbed the rope from young Jim, who had just removed it from around the hole. White Cloud made a circular loop on one end, then swung the loop over his head a couple of times before launching it out over the water towards the horse. He knew he had only one chance, because the weight of the sleigh would quickly pull the horse under the frigid water. The rope floated through the air in what seemed like slow motion and then nestled over the horse's head and around his neck. The other men joined White Cloud on the rope and gently began easing the horse to the edge of the ice. Mr. Elliot had joined them now, and together they got the horse closer. "I will tell you when to pull again," White Cloud told the men. "When I tighten the rope slightly around the horse's neck, the choking won't hurt him, but will cause him to rear up in the water. When he does that, he will be above the edge. Then everyone pull hard and we will slide him onto the ice. Will, you get ready to cut the harness and release the weight of the sleigh. I'm sorry, Malcolm, but you're going to lose your sleigh." "We have to do it. I need to save my horse," Malcolm immediately replied. "Okay, men, on my signal," White Cloud said. "Are you ready, Will?" "Ready," Will answered. "Now!" White Cloud shouted as he tightened the rope around the panicked horse's neck. Just as he predicted, the horse reared up, and when he did, the men pulled the big animal onto the ice. The buoyancy of the water held the horse up long enough for the men to get him to safety. Will immediately cut the harness attached to the sleigh. He watched as it sat on top of the water for a few seconds and then slowly sink below the surface and out of view. John Freeman, Henry P., and the rest of them grabbed all the available blankets and covered the horse and rubbed him vigorously to get his circulation back and prevent him from going into shock. After several minutes, the horse began attempting to stand, so they all stood back as Malcolm assisted him to his feet. After standing there and shaking some of the water off, the big horse seemed to begin settling down. When he could see his horse was okay, Malcolm turned to Mr. Elliot and said, "Looks like my old faithful horse, old Herman, and I won the race." "You sure did, Malcolm," Mr. Elliot said, "and a well-deserved victory, I might add. Tie your horse to the back of my sleigh and come on back to my house. We'll drop Herman at his warm stall, and then we can go have some hot apple cider together." The two friends climbed onto Mr. Elliot's sleigh, and with the horse tied to the back, they disappeared into the morning mist. The other men stood around the hole in the ice, looking in the direction of the departing men. They turned and faced each other, shrugged their shoulders, then went back to work. After a week of ice harvesting, they finally had filled the ice houses of John Freeman and Henry P. Between the two of them, they would be able to supply their families and the community with ice for the rest of the year. May had arrived, and the plans for the wedding between Parthenia Perry and Henry Walls were going great. Kazar, Parthenia, Jane King, and Aunt Lynetta met nearly every day, with Henry W. sometimes joining in to add his ideas. Their wedding was becoming the most anticipated event for a long time in the Elmstead Puce settlement. Henry W. had asked his brother Matthew to be his best man, and Parthenia's sister Sarah was her maid of honor. On the day of the wedding, the weather was beautiful. The sun was shining, and just as Parthenia had hoped, the flowers were blooming. Prior to exchanging their wedding vows, the pastor from the First Baptist Church of Puce delivered a wonderful sermon on marriage and the importance of a man and woman loving and respecting each other. At the wedding reception, it seemed everyone in the community was there. When Henry W. and Parthenia came from the church, they were driven by little Carl and Lynn Baker in their wagon, which was decorated with red roses, along with their horse Beauty. The bride and groom were a beautiful sight, and you could see how happy the two were. Will watched the newly married couple and wondered when he would meet his true love. He knew that the time had come to leave the farm and go back to following his dreams. A week after the wedding, Will packed his bags and left the Elmstead Puce settlement for the second and what he knew would be his last time. He may come back to visit, but he would never live there again.